Hey, welcome to a monthly wrap up on Hollie McKay's Substack. Hollie, we've got a number of articles that you have put out this month and just a ton of interesting stuff. We're going to focus on three features I think are particularly poignant to go talk about. And then also, like talk about ongoing series and publishing stuff from long time stuff. Number one, you put something out on cluster bombs, and so tell us a little bit about that.
This is something that I've been writing about for a while, and you wouldn't think it would be as controversial as it is, but it is. And that is the use of cluster munitions, which the White House recently sent the US stockpile for use in Ukraine. Of course, Russia has been using cluster munitions. Ukraine has been using Turkey supplied cluster munitions really since the beginning of the war. But I guess for me, having seen the use of this in many different countries, from Iraq to Afghanistan, really don't or feel very against the fact that my sort of tax dollars are being used for these particular munitions. So basically, how these work is they're sort of a large shape, and inside you've got a multitude of different bombs. And so when they're dropped, they really spread into a vast area. And unlike a traditional landmine, it's really impossible to map. Also, these have a very high failure rate, which means that they don't detonate when they hit. And they can stay active for decades and decades and will often kill children and farmers and very poor people for a long time after a war has concluded. And it's really searing to see this happen. You see not only death, but children losing their eyesight, their limbs, their internal organs are very damaged, and these look like toys. So you can understand why children would pick these up. And the fact that they're now being deployed in 2023, when really most of our allies, more than 100 countries, have signed treaties banning the use of cluster bombs. And the US had really, although it didn't sign on directly to ban it, as of 2016, it was sort of completely phased out of the US arsenal. And these were really just kind of left there in case they were needed to be used basically in sort of that DMZ area of outside of North Korea, really as a deterrent for the North Korean army from kind of stepping over that border. But the fact that they are being used again in the theater of war, to me, is very disturbing, and I think should really disturb most taxpaying Americans.
Okay, well, watching it from the other side, it's been very, very clear that people are running out of ammunition for artillery shells, which are more precise forms of warfare. And it strikes me as getting to be a bit on the desperate side to keep that war going. But
It
and
is, and of course, I understand Ukraine's desperation. They're using it on their territory, which means that effectively it's going to kill their own people for a long time to come. But at the same time, the US does have the discretion to decide what ammunition that it wants to supply and what weapons it wants to supply. And to me, there's just sort of really no reason to ever use a cluster munition in war again. And just the fact that, people will say, but Russia's doing it, we can go back and forth and say that certainly doesn't make it right.
yeah, okay, all right. Well, I agree. Let's move on to another feature. So you did another piece on the trauma of uh, people that have suffered from the war in Myanmar, Burma. Yeah, and in particular, how the shadow of that trauma follows people no matter where they go. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a place that I have covered previously, but it's also one of those small landlocked countries in Asia where it doesn't really get much attention compared to Ukraine and Afghanistan or Syria or any of these sort of larger scale wars. But this war has really been going since the end of the Second World War. And it's never really stopped. And you have this sort of Burmese army, this very nationalist army that absolutely does horrific things, particularly to ethnic minorities within the country, the Karen, the Kachin, the Rohingyas. And the stories are really just mind blowing from these sort of endless skirmishes. And the survivor that I talked to for this piece, that was his childhood, was sort of growing up, seeing women taken from the village raped, burned alive, babies thrown into fires. These are really unfathomable things that continue today and yet really get such little attention because A, they really know it's not of strategic value to the United States at this point in time. And so the Burmese army is really able to get away with a lot of these atrocities. And I hope that in being able to highlight some of these personal stories, that it will give people an understanding into something that is really more than a statistic, because we can look at statistics all day, but I think it's really critical to hear these firsthand accounts of what people have endured and experienced and how hard that must be to even though you've survived and you've gotten out of the country, but to really see it continuing and to see such a lack of political will to really do anything about it.
Yeah. Well, nightmares. They actually can go on for generations.
They can, and then you've got generational trauma with that as well. Children from that lineage who may not have ever lived in the country or experienced it, but certainly carry some of that through as well. And I think as a war reporter, I've seen that time and time again.
Yeah. All right. Well, third in the poignant articles for the month of July, you did something on a policeman in Arizona. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, well, I think obviously in this time and especially over the last few years, policing has taken a real hit in the country. And I think often police officers will be the first to say that the scrutiny is often warranted and that things have happened that shouldn't have happened. But for the most part, I think that we've kind of lost perspective on the importance of law enforcement and the importance of the rule of law in our society. And so again, it's taking these very personal stories and bringing them to light as opposed to just kind of looking at statistics. So with this, I interviewed an officer and a detective that I have worked with and known for a long time, named Chris Bauhi from Arizona. And he and I first connected many years ago when he was really going above and beyond to find justice for women, immigrant women that were killed by honor killing. So in this case, they'd come from Iraq, and the father and other relatives had very brutally killed a young woman. And these sort of tend to get covered up as murders, but they're not. There's a lot more to it than that. And so he was really trying to bring justice to that case. And so sort of since then, and we've talked many times about the different cases he's worked on, the very difficult investigations, and then having to sort of do that in the face of a lot of societal pushback, a lack of funding, a huge dip in morale. These are really big challenges for policemen and women. And I think that it's really important to highlight why they do their job and how difficult that job is. And it's certainly not all about sort of cruising the streets with a gun and feeling a sense of power, but there's a lot more, again, trauma that's embedded into that. So I wanted to sort of highlight things a little bit from their perspective.
Yeah, and you did a very good job of getting the perspective. People should read that article because it speaks a lot to the calling and dedication that it takes to do that kind of work. Okay. Hey, so other things, you've got some ongoing series. I know you're doing a lot of quotes from your book on quotations, and how far are you into that now? I think it's like 50 of them.
No.
So like
Yeah, we're
yeah.
sort of around well, there's 50 different sort of segments or vignettes, if you will. And I'm not sure how much we're into it right now, but each week a different vignette is sort of published with something very meaningful that I've learned from someone sort of out in the field working. And it's words that never leave you because they're quotes that or sayings or expressions or moments that really stay with you. And the lesson that I learned from that I wanted to share in the hopes that other people will also take something away from that.
Yeah. And then last, I noticed that you also have done some really deep dives into past events, and in particular, your trip to Iran, which was some time ago. But I've never really seen you cover it with as much depth as you did in these recent articles. Tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, so that's a two-part series. So that's sort of been looking at sort of quite extensive, and I visited Iran in the summer of 2017 and didn't really write about it at the time. It wasn't specifically a work trip, as I say in the articles, I talk about being a tourist there and what that entailed. So this was my first time really writing about some of those experiences and the people that I met and the places I went to and how I got around and sort of what I ate and how I even got into the country, which are all sort of, I think, can be quite mystical for a lot of people that certainly, given the geopolitical tensions between Washington and Tehran, the fact that it is still open for tourism and it is still possible to go there. I will caveat that with it's not completely smooth sailing, but it also may be very different to what your preconceived notions are.
Yeah, well, I found it pretty interesting because I had to live through that trip with you in real time, and several of the incidents that you pointed out that happened to you were, you know, I remember them from the receiving end of the text. Is like, why did this happen? Why did that happen?
Yeah. Well, mind you, I didn't really have my phone on too much there. So that was
No,
a bit
you
of
did
a
not.
safety
And
mechanism. But having said that, certainly I was very nervous and leading up to it. I'm sure you heard a lot about my nerves and let's say doing something stupid, and even going. And so I certainly had a lot of sleepless nights. But yeah, it was sort of felt like it was my last opportunity to see that place. And certainly looking back, I'm very glad that I did.
yeah, I think it is. I think I picked you up at the airport when you came back on that one. I don't think I've ever seen you more tired than from that trip.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely exhausted, I remember.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, your books and stuff, where can people find them?
Well, the easiest way is probably to send you to my website, which has all the links to the books that you can get directly through Amazon or through the publisher. So that is just my name, holliemckay.com/books, HOLLIEMCKAY.com.
Yeah, finally. And this wrap up, I think, just kind of points out how important independent journalism is. So I'd like to close by, you know, doing a little advertorial for you and basically say, this is the kind of thing that I believe people should subscribe to, because continue to encourage you to do this kind of independent journalism is so important.
And it is, it's tough. And many times I think every day I question whether I can continue to do it. Just, from a financial perspective, my love of it is still there, but we all have to survive in life. And so it certainly is something I have to toy with every day, but I'm continuing to have hope it will it will work out to be something I can continue to sustain. So I certainly rely on yeah, the generosity of people to do that.
Very good. Well, thank you, Holly, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much.